1, 2, 1, 2, 3, free! By 1959, there was little that could have predicted the success that Tove Jansson would find with the Moomins. After so many years of barely making ends meet, Jansson was now a best-selling author, the cartoonist for one of Europe's most popular daily comic strips, and the overseer of a growing merchandising juggernaut. It seemed like everyone wanted a piece of the Moomins, and it began to weigh on Jansson. Many fans of her original stories considered the newer incarnations of these characters as going against the original spirit of her writing, focusing more on daily hijinks instead of the cozy fairy tales where they were first introduced. This, coupled with the increasing levels of burnout towards making Moomin stories, would cause Jansson to ultimately end her tenure as the primary writer of the Moomin comics, passing the role onto her brother Lars. While the Moomin stories would continue to evolve throughout the 1960s, the series would see its biggest spikes in popularity through the newest media frontier, television. While the Moomins have experienced great growths in popularity through the comics, this first spike would occur through a Western German TV show produced by the Augsburger Puppet Theater in 1959. Despite the lower budgets and lifeless animation that could be commonly seen in most puppet productions at the time, the series does a remarkable job adapting Finn Family Moomin Troll and Moomin Summer Madness in a way that nicely introduces newcomers to the series. While the series would later be released in a DVD box set in Germany, there isn't much of a way to view this series on non-PAL region DVDs, save for clips of the show being distributed online. And just to give a fair warning, this is going to be a common story when it comes to many of these adaptations. Despite this, the series remained popular amongst German households, causing Swedish television to reach out to Jansson to help make a multi-parted series about them. Despite Jansson's varying levels of burnout with the Moomins, she was always interested in adapting these stories for a new audience. And even though the two had moved on to different romantic partners, Tove remained good friends with Vivica Bandler for the rest of her life, with Vivica often being her first choice of people to bring the Moomins to the stage. This was the case for Swedish television's 1969 series, simply titled Moomin Trollette, or The Moomin Troll. With Bandler as director, Tove and Lars Jansson as writers, the show features many of the same actors that were seen in theatrical adaptations. Something that differentiated this production from other adaptations is the inclusion of an original story written by Lars and Tove. The show centers on the king finding the Moomins and devoting himself to civilizing the family, only for him to becoming acclimated to their lifestyle. Amongst this storyline, the series is also known for making a very sudden change in the second episode, after there were complaints about the practicality of the costumes. The results are somewhat horrifying. What? Like most other things produced in the Moomins' home country, the show would receive a lot of attention from Swedish fans, though there was little attempt to branch out to the international market. All of this would be greatly contrasted that same year, when Jansson had received a letter from Tokyo Movie Shinsa, a Japanese animation company who are today known for Akira, Lupin III, and their work on Batman the Animated Series. Though in the early days of the studio, they had wanted to make the Moomins amongst the first of their animated productions. And while Jansson wasn't too familiar with Japanese animation, she was more than interested. And after the executive Yasuo Yamamoto suddenly showed up in Finland, the two were able to make a deal. Though the result of this deal would not be at all what Tove expected. On its face, the show is an enjoyable watch as it adapts some of the original stories. However, if you spend a certain amount of time with this series, you might be shocked to see how far it moves away from the source material. According to production staff, the show made some departures from the source material in order to appeal to typical shonen productions that were commonly shown at the time. This results in more fighting, a less friendly atmosphere, and characters that greatly differ from their book counterparts. While there can be some arguments made that this show is looking to emulate the comics more than the novels, these drastic differences were enough to turn some people off of this adaptation. Most notably Jansson, who exclaimed, "My Moomin is no driver, fighter, or moneymaker." Despite being an attitude shared by many of the production staff, including a keyframe animator named Hayao Miyazaki, there wasn't much that could be done to change Jansson's mind on the series. As a result, the Moomin series would be taken over by Mushi Productions, under a label that would be later called World Masterpiece Theater, a project devoted to adapting classic European literature to Japanese audiences. While the show began to more closely adhere to Jansson's writing, she would not allow the series to be internationally distributed, which has resulted in the show remaining a strange curiosity for Moomin fans outside of Japan. And after some time, the show's license went on to expire, causing all 52 of these episodes to be available online through various video sharing sites. Despite the condemnation leveled against the series, the introduction of the anime made Moomin extremely popular in Japan, and the series would be later remade in 1972, under the name Shin Moomin, which adheres more closely to the books and is likewise a more enjoyable watch. If you're okay with watching it without translations, that is. Despite being disappointed with the anime, that didn't stop Jansson from pursuing televised adaptations. The first would be a live-action costume series called Moominvalley, which translates to Moominvalley. The series took great advantage of rising technology like the blue screen to achieve effects once only seen in animation. It also saw a lot more creative input from the Janssons, as Tove became a lot more protective of her characters. While this series does a decent job of adapting some of Jansson's writing, the mimed performances and expressionless costumes make it difficult to enjoy the show without any subtitles or translations. Though soon enough, the Moomins' popularity in both Europe and Japan led to a demand for a new TV show, leading to the Polish animation studio Semaphore to create a stop-motion adaptation of the series, building upon the proud traditions of Polish stop-motion puppetry to create one of the most well-known incarnations of these characters. 1977's The Moomins, commonly called the Fuzzy Felt Moomins due to their appearance, closely followed the plots of most of Jansson's original stories. While some might be turned off by the jerky animation style commonly seen in Eastern European stop-motion, not to mention some of the extremely dark and intense moments of the show, it really does justice to Jansson's original stories, and is one of the most accessible ways to get into the series outside of the books. Jansson would later recount how the series stuck most closely to her original stories, not only being able to capture the lighthearted fantasy of Moominvalley, but also the introspective contemplation that other adaptations often elect to ignore. Unlike most of these adaptations, the Fuzzy Felt Moomins would go on to be distributed throughout all of Europe, notably including the first of these adaptations to be translated into English when it was aired on CITV in 1983. To this day, it remains one of the most beloved versions of the series, as it would be later remastered, compiled, and redistributed many times over the years. While there are many ways this series can be enjoyed, the first 18 episodes of the original British series and a compilation movie titled Moomin and the Comet Chase can be seen for free on Amazon Prime as of this writing, making this one of the few legal ways to watch a Moomin adaptation in the United States. By the late 1980s, Tove Jansson was content with her relationship to the Moomins. While she had no desire to write any more Moomin stories, she was still an integral part of publishing translations and creating beautiful models of various scenes from the stories with Tuulikki. So you could imagine the uneasiness that befell her when she and Tuulikki were approached by a Finnish producer named David Lindson, asking for the rights to create another animated adaptation of Moomin. Lindson is primarily known for producing various collaborations between European and Japanese animation studios, his previous most famous example including Alfred J. Quack. While they were extremely hesitant at first, once the Janssons had seen their work, both Tove and Lars signed off on the production, with the added caveat that the two would act as creative consultants and revisionists towards any screenplays. Like Livson's previous work, the show would be a co-production between the Finnish-Dutch-Japanese studio Telescreen, as well as the Japanese animation studio Visual 80. The result was Tanoshi Moomin Ika, or Delightful Moominfamily, which has gone on to be one of the most recognizable versions of these characters. Chances are, if you're an American who is now just getting into the series, these are the versions of the characters that you are most acquainted with. Similar to the 1977 series, much of this show spends its time adapting the many original Moomin stories, as well as some storylines seen in the comic strips. And while these have resulted in some faithful adaptations, there is some notable difference between these and the original stories. The first being the incorporation of Little Mai into earlier stories, an increased presence for Snork Maiden and Sniff, some minor differences in the retellings of Finn Family Moomin Troll and Moominpappa's memoirs, as well as the inclusion of original characters like Alicia and her grandmother, who are both witches. One final change that's relevant to this series' present popularity is some minor changes to Snufkin's character. Unlike some appearances in the original stories, Snufkin often acts friendly to most people that he meets, which is contrasted by the isolated attitude seen in the books. Likewise, this friendlier attitude results in his ideologies to be a lot more palatable and approachable to general audiences. Is it any wonder why one of the most popular scenes from this entire series is the Let's Go Commit Crime clip? It advocates a contempt for authority and hierarchical structures in a manner that demonstrates the good intentions of the characters, demonstrating an ideology that some would consider too radical had it been presented in a less friendly manner. Alongside these changes from the source material, this series is well regarded for its lively character designs, beautifully painted backgrounds, and well-constructed scenes, all of which are greatly enhanced by Sumio Shiratori's enchanting soundtrack. Overall, the series was much more well-received by audiences and the Janssons, and would be distributed to many different countries outside of Japan, including most of Northern and Western Europe, England, and most notably, Hawaii. While the Moomins had never grown much in popularity on print or on screen in the United States, Hawaii's large population of Japanese immigrants created a large demand for English dubs of the show to be broadcasted on local television. While the series tended to grow more popular with each subsequent adaptation, to say that this occurred upon the show's release is an understatement. With the release of this new anime, there was a sudden demand for new translations of the Moomin stories and new types of Moomin merchandise. Alongside the dolls and playsets that were created, the Moomins saw their faces on everything from sushi, cars, airplanes, department stores, video games, and mugs. The Moomin mugs especially would soon become highly sought after collector's items, as they released new designs for the mugs after every year, which continues to this day. This phenomenon, later called the Moomin Boom, would see an influx of Moomin fans spending massive amounts of monies on these characters, resulting in the series being worth an estimated 700 million euros in yearly revenue. With this success, Dennis Livson would use some of these profits to construct a theme park on a small island near Naantali called Moomin World. The park boasts many themed attractions lifted directly from the stories, most notably a complete recreation of the Moomin's house that guests still visit to this day. While the Janssons were able to enjoy much of this success, there were some fans of the franchise that looked towards the anime and the subsequent Moomin Boom as a watered-down version of these characters, with some remarking how it commercialized and invalidated some of the philosophical elements to the original stories. And when comparing the original books to this series, it cannot be denied that the show does take less of a hard stance on certain topics and characterizations. One notable example that comes to mind being the more lighthearted tone that was implemented in their adaptation of Moominland Midwinter, swapping out some of the story's melancholy for lighthearted fun. Even though there was less of a cerebral edge to this series, I still feel that it was decently ahead of its time compared to other programs airing at that moment. While certain shows like Batman the Animated Series and X-Men attempted to broach more serious and mature topics, Moomin was able to draw upon the source material in order to discuss ideas like abuse, depression, and emotional maturity, something that wouldn't be more commonly seen in children's programs until more recently. Out of all the versions of Moomin that can be found right now, this show is probably amongst the most accessible. From its lighthearted tone, its good balance of drama and humor, and the many enjoyable performances that can be seen within these characters. To this day, the show has been regarded as a classic for many children who grew up with it, resulting in Tove Jansson becoming one of the most beloved fantasy writers in most of Europe and Japan. Though this success became bittersweet, as it meant that Jansson became extremely busy in her old age, leading her to move away from her secluded life in order to oversee the Moomin Boom. Eventually, after many years of smoking, Tove Jansson was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Despite some of the trials and difficulties that she faced throughout her life, she recounted how she was very content with the work she was able to do and the people she was able to meet, and she would pass away on the 27th of June, 2001, at the age of 86. Despite the large shoes that were left behind, the Moomins were still able to remain in the Jansson family, as the series became more popular than ever. Alongside Moomin World, there were many different locations that were opened up following Jansson's death. These included different exhibits in the Temporary Art Museum, a temporary exhibit in New York City, a children's park in Hano, Japan, and many different Moomin shops and cafes that opened up all around the world. With the success of this series moving into the new millennium, there were talks about being able to expand its presence into new territories. This primarily consisted of publishing new translations of the novels and comics, which were created by Squarefish and Drawn and Quarterly Publishing respectively, as well as a 2014 adaptation of the comic storyline Moomins on the Riviera, which was released in correlation with Tove Jansson's 100th birthday. And while these were well received by many fans of the series, it was speculated that it wouldn't pick up in popularity if they were to begin marketing the Moomins to American audiences, in an age where large franchises are king. As cited in this 2009 Reuters article, the consolidating industry is tending to focus on established characters to minimize risk, rather than introduce new ones. While this does not rule out that the Moomins could catch on, there was very little evidence to show that a niche product like the Moomins can thrive in the profit-driven US market. Which leads us to the present Moomin renaissance that can be seen online. Despite the release of a star-studded animated series produced by Finnish studio Gutsy Animation, most newer American fans of the series have been more focused on previous incarnations of these characters. While this is partially due to a lack of legal ways to view this series in the United States, I think it is more of a testament to the timeless quality of these characters. At the beginning of this video, I asked what might have changed about the Moomins to attract such a wider audience. Though if this retrospective was any indication, there hasn't been much to fundamentally alter the nature of these stories and these characters. Even as the stories became more philosophical and adult, none of the characters really changed who they were. Their core personalities remained intact, but their perspectives on the world and how they viewed others changed and evolved as Tove Jansson began to experience the world in new and different ways. As a general rule, I try my best to keep a safe distance from auteur theory, though it's clear to see just how personal a work the Moomins are to Jansson, and I believe it is from her experiences that we can see a core to this current renaissance. Unlike some authors from the early 20th century, most of the struggles that Jansson discusses in her work are still widely applicable to our modern world, especially to marginalized audiences who haven't been widely addressed until more recently. All her life, Jansson had to struggle with the uncertainty of being an artist on the margins of society, not only dealing with the difficulties of being a queer woman, but also coping with financial issues, mental illness, and an unstable political climate that racked her with a great deal of fear and uncertainty towards the world. Though through the Moomins, she could attempt to address her various struggles in a way that was comforting and peaceful by creating a world filled with characters that could help her better understand her relationship with herself and others. And it is from that struggle and desire to understand that many fans of Moomin, both new and old, have been able to find a place of serenity within the peaks of Moominvalley. as well as offering some ways to address those struggles. As it turns out, the Moomins haven't become popular because they've changed. It's because many Americans, particularly those in the younger generations, have begun to better appreciate the ideas put forth by the Moomins. Their acceptance of all identities, their disregard for class and materialism, and the rejection of unjust authority that have all come to embody the values of modern audiences. According to Jansson, only passion, hope, and joy can be honest. Nothing I've ever been forced to do has ever brought joy to me or those around me. So while your mileage might vary with certain stories, I think that there is a lot that can be learned from Tove Jansson's work. And perhaps through this appreciation, we can take the values of these stories to heart in order to make the world a better place. Thank you for watching. Best wishes. Also, let's make like Snufkin and fill this place with crime. Come on!